Good afternoon, and thank you for joining the National Conference of State Legislatures for this session entitled State Policy 101, Intro to Public Pension Design and Funding. My name is Anna Petrini. I am a Senior Policy Specialist in NCSL's Employment, Labor, and Retirement Program. I work on pensions and retirement topics, and I will be moderating this session today. Before we dive into the world of public pension design and funding, I want to take a quick poll just to gauge how personal this topic is for many of you. You'll see poll number 1 in an orange box below your video player. If you want to select that and just answer the question, do you or your spouse expect to collect income from a traditional pension in retirement? So we'll give just a moment for you all to enter your answers. I understand that this topic can sometimes feel dry or technical, but I hope as you follow along today, you'll bear this in mind. Pensions are a big ticket item for many states with a real impact on state and local budgets, but they also operate at a very human scale. With real implications for individuals' retirement security and how we shape the public workforce. So let's see if I can get a read here on the results. It looks like 71% of you expect to draw income in your retirement from a public pension. So you all have some skin in the game. That's great to see. So today's event is part of a series of 30 educational sessions that are geared toward those who want to build foundational policy knowledge. So this is going to be beginner stuff. Before we get started, I'll just point out a few housekeeping items. To the right of the video player, you'll note tabs that say chat and Q&A. If you want to ask any of our speakers in the second half of the program a question, use the Q&A box. If you see a question that you like, you can upvote it using the up arrow. The second half of our session today, like I said, is going to be a Q&A format, so we'll be getting to most of your questions at that point. Please don't be shy about typing them in. You can find speaker bios and resources related to this session directly underneath the video player. And finally, if at any time you need technical help, please press the help button at the bottom right of the page. And looks like I'm frozen here a little bit. I'm trying to advance my slides and not finding much.
Hey, Anna, try clicking on the screen. And then, yeah.
Okay, great. So the purpose of this session is to offer some basic information about how state and local pensions are designed and funded. Retirement benefits play a pivotal role in attracting and retaining a skilled workforce. While many public pensions are on a sustainable funding path, a few have fallen conspicuously behind. So the gap between pension assets and liabilities for all 50 states taken together now stands at $1.24 trillion. So that's roughly the GDP of Spain. The first part of our session will offer an introduction to design considerations. We'll take a look at the key characteristics of public employee pension plans and ask how they're structured. And we'll also try to get a handle on a number of the acronyms that you hear flying around. So DB, DC, OPEB, COLA, these describe important design features. Then we'll move on to a discussion of financing arrangements for public sector plans with our two distinguished panelists. We have national experts from the Pew Charitable Trust and the consulting firm Pension Trustee Advisors. And with that long and somewhat breathless introduction, let's finally turn to some key characteristics of public pension plans. So I'm going to try to be organized about this and proceed sort of methodically through a who, what, where, when, and why with only occasional detours. Let's start with the who. Who participates in state and local retirement plans? Nearly 21 million people in the US, including active employees, former public employees who have earned benefits that they're not yet collecting, and then current retirees. Approximately 1/4 of employees of state and local governments participate in a retirement system in lieu of Social Security. So this includes about 40% of public school teachers and more than 2/3 of public safety workers, so police officers, firefighters, and other first responders. In a handful of states, most of the public employees actually don't participate in Social Security, and those states are Alaska, Colorado, Louisiana, Maine, Massachusetts, Nevada, and Ohio. And I'm not going to get into the historical reasons for this. For our purposes today, the upshot is that in those systems where public workers are not covered by Social Security, the benefits and employer contributions are on average going to be higher in order to compensate for that lack of coverage. So on to the why and the what. Public sector retirement plans for state and local government employees have been around since about the late 1800s. In many cases, the plans were offered to make public employment more competitive with employment in the private sector, which often offered higher wages. The thinking was that although an employee might earn a lower salary doing government work, their retirement benefits would be guaranteed, and this would be a draw, right? This would help attract and retain a skilled public workforce. Today, state and local government pensions are important to overall national savings. They account for about 19% of total retirement savings assets. And by comparison, individual retirement accounts such as 401ks make up about 28% of assets. There's been a lot written about benefit adequacy and the metrics we use when we talk about retirement security, both inside the public sector and in the private sector. I'll just flag one recent analysis from the Pew Charitable Trust that found that in most cases, career government workers, can expect full replacement income, meaning that their retirement benefits will approximate their final take-home pay. So you can see the clear benefit for employees and for employers. Let's talk a little bit about the value for the economy overall. Recent studies suggest that public pension benefits have positive effects on state and local economies. The National Association of State Retirement Administrators has some data that I'll draw on. In 2019, state and local government retirement systems in the US distributed $155 billion more in benefits than they received in taxpayer-funded contributions. And personal income from state and local government pensions exceeds the personal income derived from the nation's farming, fishing, logging, and hotel industries combined. So we're going to talk more in the second half of the program about how pensions impact state budgets. But I want to take a slight detour now and just glance at recent pension funding data for the states. Before we do that, let's take another quick poll. If you will click on poll number 2, the orange box below your video player, I'm asking how well funded do you think the major statewide retirement plans are in your state? And I mean the major ones covering state and local employees and teachers. And the reason I ask, policymakers expend so much time and energy thinking about the funded ratios of their plans. A big part of the reason is that a well-funded pension system in the public sector can cost billions of dollars less each year than a severely underfunded one. In a well-funded system, the state or local government is setting aside money every year while people are working to pay for their benefits when they retire. When states do that, compounded investment earnings wind up paying for the majority of the benefit. But in severely underfunded systems, they're losing out on those compounded investment earnings. And as a result, more of the cost has to come out of state and local budgets. So let's take a look at some actual numbers that the Pew Charitable Trust collected. These are based on 2018 figures. And you can see here that the darker shades are the better funded system. And let's see, I'm looking at some results from our poll. So it looks like 33% of you said you thought your plans were below 60% funded, 46% thought 60 to 69% funded, and 7% thought they were 70 to 79 and 80 to 89% respectively. Okay, and 14% went with 90 to 100% funded. Interesting. Great. All right, let's go back to our who, what, where, when, and why slide. Let's resume with some of the what questions. So there are several thousand government-sponsored retirement systems in the US. Locally administered plans vastly outnumber their state counterparts. So there are over 5,000 locally administered plans and closer to 300 state administered plans. However, most plan members, that is 90%, and most plan assets, it's 82%, are in the state administered systems. So while you've got this huge number of individual systems out there, the data I'm presenting today relates to the main state administered systems, those for public employees and teachers typically. There are two main types of retirement plans: defined benefit plans, or DBs, and defined contribution plans, or DCs. We will talk about this at length in just a moment, but for now, just know that a DB plan provides a guaranteed lifetime income, while a DC plan is more like a savings account. The Federal Reserve reported in March of 2020 that the combined value of defined benefit plan assets held by state and local governments had increased to $4.82 trillion, this as of the last quarter of 2019. So that just gives you a sense of the scale of the numbers that are in play. In terms of the where, we will talk extensively about the geography of pension plan coverage in just a little while and which states have adopted which kinds of models. In terms of the when, I just want to mention a couple of trends. All states have enacted major changes to their public pension systems in order to reduce costs in recent years. Among the most frequent reforms are reduced benefit levels, longer vesting periods, increased age and service requirements, limited cost of living adjustments, and increased employer and employee contributions. Some governments have also moved new employees into plans with entirely different structures that are designed to shift risk from employers onto employees. So not surprisingly, public employees are contesting many of these changes in some states, so it's worth keeping an eye on litigation developments in this area. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about how pensions work. Pension characteristics include participation requirements. So is it mandatory? Is it optional? Required contributions by employers and employees, vesting requirements, benefit levels, the mode of benefit distribution. Unlike in the private sector, nearly all employees of state and local government are required to share in the cost of their benefits. So pension benefits for employees of state and local governments are paid out from trust funds to which public employees and employers have contributed during an employee's working years. Employee contributions are typically set as a percentage of salary by statute or by the board that oversees the retirement system. Contribution rates typically range between 4 and 8% of pay, although there are certainly outliers. Typically, after an employee has worked a certain number of years, his or her right to receive a benefit becomes vested. And that's just to say that he or she now has a legal right to receive that benefit. Interestingly, roughly 45% of public employees will leave their jobs without fully vesting in their defined benefits. So as I mentioned, there are two main types of retirement plans: defined benefit plans and defined contribution plans. Among employees of state and local government, the vast majority participate in a DB plan. Some retirement plans, referred to as hybrids, combine components of DB and DC plans. And then one type of hybrid design used more often in the private sector, but occasionally in the public sector, so worth mentioning, is called a cash balance approach. So we'll touch on that in a little while. Notably, all state workers and most local workers who have access to a DB plan also have access to supplemental DC plans. So you'll hear people talking about 457s or 403Bs or 401As. For our purposes today, you can ignore all that. When I reference a DC plan or a hybrid, I'm talking about the primary benefit, not these optional supplemental add-on plans. We're also going to touch on other key features of retirement plans for public workers, including cost of living adjustments to help cope with inflation. And then I also want to talk about retiree healthcare benefits just a little bit, because these tend to get short shrift. So periodically, we'll mention recent legislative changes in all these areas as well. So the overwhelming majority of statewide retirement plans for public employees and for teachers are defined benefit plans. These provide a guaranteed lifetime retirement benefit based on an employee's years of service and final salary. A DB pension provides retired workers with a steady stream of income that is guaranteed for the remainder of the retiree's life. So that's really the important thing to keep in mind here, is this guarantee with a defined benefit plan. Although most state plans require employee contributions, the amount of the benefit they'll ultimately receive isn't based directly on those contributions. Instead, the amount of monthly income each employee receives is ordinarily a function of the years of service with the employer, the worker's pay at the end of his or her career, and a fixed multiplier that's determined by the plan. So under this type of final average pay or final average salary design, the plan might provide a benefit multiplier of, say, 2% of salary. If an employee works for 30 years and has a final average salary of $100,000, and I just picked an easy number here, then the employee's annual pension income is going to be $60,000. So other models besides the defined benefit have existed for a long time and have attracted increasing attention in recent years. So let's talk about some of those now. Defined contribution plans function like a savings account or 401k. DC plans can help stabilize states' costs for new hires as a fixed percentage of salary, with the potential for slight variations based on how employer matching contributions are structured. DC plans are intended to allow for easier mobility in and out of state service, offering less incentive to stay on with a given employer than a DB plan would. So there's no penalty for employees who want to move on with only a few years of government service. The main point with DC plans is that the risks and responsibilities are shifted to the employee. It's the employee who's taking on the risk of losing funds with investment fluctuations. And there's no guaranteed rate of return with DC plans. This is important, this next bit. With DCs, employees must usually choose. They have to make choices. And so that's an easy way to kind of remember DC. The salient feature here is choice, C for choice. Employees must usually choose their contribution amounts, which means that they can run the risk of saving too little. They could possibly outlive their savings, which is a non-issue with the DB plan. And then employees also need to choose among investment options with DCs. So with these risks and responsibilities, there can be a need for increased employee education about these types of plans. And finally, administrative and investment costs are generally higher with DCs than with DBs. Now, hybrid plans combine elements of DB and DC plans, and these can come in two varieties. There's a side-by-side hybrid. This plan, pictured in the orange on this slide on the right-hand side, it combines elements of a DB and a DC. So you have a DB component, and then you have a separate DC retirement savings account. These two pieces operate independently, but together provide the retirement benefit. So that's a side-by-side hybrid. Then you have a stacked hybrid, and here the defined benefit is the primary benefit up to a certain specified income level. But above that income level, then you have a DC that kicks in for additional, that higher increment beyond that threshold level of income. So no state has adopted a stacked hybrid model, but this idea does tend to come up in reform conversations in the states. I know it was part of the discussion in 2017 in Pennsylvania, and it also has gained some traction internationally. I believe Canada is one example of a country where there are stacked hybrid plans that are operational. So we're winding down here. I'll just talk very briefly about one species of hybrid plan, and this is the cash balance plan. So in some ways, cash balance plans are like defined contribution plans. A cash balance plan gives every member an individual account, and employers and employees contribute to that account. But here's where it differs from a standard DC plan. Remember I said with DCs, the really salient feature was that employee choice. Well, with a cash balance plan, members don't have any choices about how the money is invested. Members' accounts instead are managed in one big trust account, just as they would be with a traditional defined benefit plan. And the point of this is to achieve economies of scale and economies of management that come along with a merged trust fund structure. In public sector cash balance plans, members are guaranteed a return on their investment. I'm not going to talk too much more about that, but let's leave it there with cash balance plans and then zoom out for a little bit of national perspective. So this map shows the states with non-defined benefit statewide retirement systems. With recently adopted changes in Pennsylvania, there are now 15 states where new employees cannot go into a pure defined benefit plan. Those are the orange, purple, and green states on this map, plus Utah. Utah and Pennsylvania are teal because, like the 6 other teal states, employees there get a choice of their primary plan. But in Utah and Pennsylvania, the choice is between a hybrid and a defined contribution plan. Washington state employees get a choice between a hybrid and a defined benefit plan. And then the rest of the teal states offer a choice between a defined benefit and a defined contribution plan. When they're given the choice between a primary defined benefit and defined contribution plan, public employees overwhelmingly choose the defined benefit pension plan. However, there are plenty of considerations that could tempt employees to elect a DC or a hybrid if they have the option. Let's take, for example, a teacher who is married to a member of the military and expects to move frequently. She may initially choose the DC plan because that portability aspect is going to be really attractive. However, if the couple's plans change and they decide to settle someplace more permanently, the teacher might want to switch over to the DB plan. Certain states require new hires to make a one-time irrevocable decision about which plan they want to join, but several other systems do allow folks to change over the course of their careers. So we're winding down rapidly, but I want to talk about cost of living adjustments. This is important. As the price of goods and services increases over time, the purchasing power of retirement income is going to go down, right? Post-employment benefit increases or cost of living adjustments or COLAs, they're all talking about the same thing, and they're all helping to insulate retirees from the effects of inflation. These are important features of most state and local government plans. Many states embraced these benefits in the 70s and 80s in response to high inflation during those eras. This valuable benefit comes at a cost. So one study explored the costs of various COLA arrangements and found that offering a 3% compounded COLA actually added 26% to the cost of the benefits paid out over the course of an average retirement. Just how much a COLA costs and how much inflation protection it affords depends on how it's structured, and states have adopted a variety of COLA types and design features. I'm not going to talk about these in depth. I will mention that there are ad hoc COLAs and automatic COLAs. There are fixed rate COLAs, and then there are COLAs that fluctuate along with inflation or are pegged to plan funding levels or investment returns. So if a plan is in a better financial position, it may be able to grant a more generous COLA. At least 29 states have attempted to scale back pension costs by reducing, suspending, or eliminating post-employment COLAs for new hires, current workers, or current retirees since 2009. So several states have revised their COLA formulas multiple times during this period. And now, last slide here, retiree health benefits. So in addition to pensions, most state and local governments offer retired public workers other post-employment benefits or OPEBs. The most important is employer subsidized health insurance coverage, though other benefits can include life, disability, and long-term care insurance. Some plans even offer legal services. States provide starkly different levels of OPEB coverage for their retirees. Mounting healthcare costs and new accounting rules have focused increased attention on this area in recent years. Importantly, there are very different legal rules that govern pension and OPEB promises. So governments basically have a lot more latitude in the OPEB space to adjust their commitments than they do in the pension world. And states can structure their OPEB benefits in all kinds of different ways. I'm not going to elaborate on that here. I will say that OPEB and pension financing differ dramatically. So here's a little refresher. Pensions rely on pre-funding, right? So each year, state and local governments transfer a set amount of earmarked cash into a dedicated pension trust fund, which invests that money along with employee contributions and then uses the earnings amassed over decades to pay out benefits. So that's pensions. On the OPEB side, in contrast, governments have traditionally used a pay-as-you-go method. So they're paying the cost of benefits claimed in a given year out of that same year's revenues. Nationwide, only about 7% of retiree healthcare obligations are currently pre-funded, though there is wide variation among states, and some have made meaningful progress of late. Nationwide, unfunded OPEB liabilities stand at about $673 billion. So thank you for bearing with me through all of that. Now that you've had a glimpse into the world of pension plan design, let's find out how states and localities are paying for these benefits. Let's ask David Drain and Flick Fornia to help us understand some pension funding basics. So bear with me just a second. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And I'm going to invite David and Flick to unmute themselves. It looks like they're sharing their video. So David Drain is an expert with the Pew Charitable Trust, and he's going to be providing some insights into unfunded liabilities and risk assessment and reporting for public plans. We're also going to chat with Flick Fornia, who provides consulting services on public pension and retirement benefits as president of his firm, Pension Trustee Advisors. So he's going to help us dig into the basics of pension actuarial practices, along with contribution rates and pension investments. So welcome to you both. Thank you so much for joining us. Let's start off with something pretty basic. So David, first to you and then to Flick. Why should this audience care about public pension funding? Can you talk about this both from the standpoint of retirement security for public workers and then the standpoint of state and local government performance?
Would be my pleasure. So first, why should you care and why should anyone care about the funding of state and local pension plans? Well, first and foremost, these liabilities represent compensation that was promised to public employees for their work as state workers, as teachers, as firefighters, and as cops. So making sure that when the benefit check is due, there's money to pay for it, it's not just important for recruitment and retention, it also represents a commitment that's been made by governments to their workforce. And from a retirement security perspective, the fact that they're depending on it is why this is such an important policy area. But that also means that that $1.24 trillion funding gap between the liabilities for state-run pension plans, and this is what should have been set aside to pay for benefits that have already been earned by workers and retirees, and the assets that these plans had on hand really serves as a form of public debt. And as we've seen, paying for that public debt has taken up a growing share of state and local resources, crowding out funding for other important public priorities and investments. And that's why we think policymakers should be paying attention both to how we got here, how a combination of contribution holidays, excessive risk, and offering unfunded benefit increases have led to real challenges for a number of states. And also some of the successful approaches we've seen states use in getting out of this or in maintaining well-funded retirement systems. Because there are useful examples of state and local governments that have an affordable and sustainable approach of providing retirement security to their public employees.
Yeah, well, I'll add a little bit to that. So part of that question is the structure of the plan. You know, you can do a defined, like a lot of companies. I used to be the actuary for the Boeing company. I've done a lot of work in the private sector too. And companies tend to not like the defined benefit plans because it is risky for them. You know, if the investment returns aren't as strong as they expect or whatever, they are left owing additional amounts, just like this unfunded gap that David talked about in the public sector side. But when someone's an employee, they need to figure out how to save enough for retirement. And so any employer has to recognize that they need a retirement vehicle of some kind. And then, so for the state and local governments, if they had a DC plan, it's really simple for them to figure out how to fund it. They just put the money in the trust fund, into the matching contribution or whatever, and then walk away and don't worry about it. Whereas if they have a DB plan, it's a lot more complicated. They might become underfunded. They could even become overfunded. I've been working in this business long enough to when lots of plans were well overfunded. But so as a citizen or a taxpayer or a legislator, when you're responsible for this promise you've made to the workers, if you've got, you need to pay attention to whether the plan's well funded or not, because if it's not, like David was saying, it's some kind of future debt. I'm not a proponent of throwing your hands up and just putting in a DC plan instead. In fact, for my first exposure to your organization was about 12 years ago. I presented at one of your conferences in New Orleans. I guess it was just after Katrina, on this idea of how much more efficient a DB plan is than a DC plan. Because like as Anna was saying, in a DB plan, the assets are invested by professionals. In a DC plan, they're invested by individual public servants on a part-time basis. Plus, on a DC plan, you don't know how long you're going to live. And in a DB plan, the actuaries are really good at predicting how long people are going to live on the average. So the DB plan can just pay enough benefits to fund people on the average, but if you're in a DC, you need to save extra. Anyway, that's kind of a sidebar, but as David said, this is critical issue for you as legislators.
All right, well, thank you. Flick, let's go back to you, and I'm hoping you can walk us through the basic retirement funding equation. So I know you've got contribution rates or contributions from employees and employers and investment earnings, and this somehow equals benefits plus administrative expenses for the plans. Can you walk us through this and tell us what we really mean with each of those terms?
Yeah, and that's kind of the job of the actuary. So each of your pension funds has an actuary that has figured things out or tried to figure things out. And the basics, as Anna said, is that the money in, contributions and investment income in the long run equals the money going out, benefits plus administrative expenses. But it's all a question of timing. You could do like your retiree healthcare OPEB plans where you have the money going in and out at the same time. You just wait and see who's going to the doctor and what their bills are, and then you just pay it. In a pension, we've happily become advanced funded, where the actuary tries to figure out how much money should be going in on a year-by-year basis so that it covers the benefits to be paid out later when people are retired. And that's kind of our job, is to come up with the liability, which is basically how much money you should have built up, and the annual cost, which is how much you want to put in. And we do all kinds of discounting and projections of how long people are going to live. Because what we want to do is we don't want current taxpayers to pay for benefits earned by prior public servants. I mean, I'll pay for the fires that are being put out today, but I don't have to pay for that fire that was put out, 20 years ago. So that's the basic idea, is that money in equals money out, but it's timing. The more money you can put in early, then the more investment income you're going to have to pay it later.
Okay, great. Let's zoom in a little bit then on this idea of unfunded liabilities. So David, I'm hoping you can talk to us about this. I know this area gets a ton of media attention. I'm hoping you can paint a slightly more nuanced picture for us. I know Pew has done a lot of work on the 50 state pension funding gap. So that's the difference between state retirement systems assets and liabilities, and how those have changed over time. Is there a big disparity between well-funded and underfunded state retirement systems? And is it possible for states at the back of the pack to catch up?
Sure. And so overall, state pension plans report about $4 trillion in liabilities and a little under $3 trillion in assets, meaning overall these benefits are about 71% funded. But that single number conceals a tremendous amount of variation between states and sometimes within states. And we look at states like Connecticut, Illinois, Kentucky, and New Jersey that were less than 50% funded, and then contrast it against states like New York, South Dakota, Tennessee, and Wisconsin, all of which were close to fully funded. And then all the states in between as well have different funding situations, different contribution policies, different plan designs, and different tools to manage risk or lack of those same tools. And obviously, part of what's useful to understand is that just every state is different. But I think the most important thing is that when we look at those differences, it's differences in policy choices. So in some cases, decisions made years or decades ago are really having negative consequences for states. But every single state experienced the Great Recession. Every single state had a dot-com crash. every single state has COVID-19. And so when we look at the places that are well-funded, it's not that they avoided those situations. It's simply that they had effective policies that built up surpluses when times were good, didn't give them away in unfunded benefit increases, made up losses when times have been tough. And that's largely in the form of having a strong contribution policy that they stuck with. And then when you look at the poorly funded states, obviously the Great Recession was not easy for anybody, but the problems there preceded the Great Recession. And really, you saw the weaknesses and challenges before that. And then obviously some of this is doom and gloom, but if you look at, obviously a number of states have made recent reforms, and I think we're hopeful, and those states are hopeful that that will turn into, a real turnaround story. And then when we look back to states like West Virginia and Maine, it shows that you really clearly can do this if you come up with a good policy and stick to it. I'll get more into the West Virginia example in a bit, but they've shown how you can have a poorly funded system gets ahead of the pack and keep offering benefits in a way that workers and retirees can feel confident that they'll be paid out.
Great. Well, thank you, David. So Flick, I'm wondering, first of all, if you have anything to add here on the unfunded liability question, and then I'm hoping you can talk in a little more detail about plans' contribution rates and investment policies and some of the challenges facing plan sponsors.
Yeah, thanks, Anna, and I'll kind of do it together. So, as I mentioned, I started in this business in 1979 when inflation was really high. And in the 90s, investment returns were phenomenal. And companies were switching to 401ks in a large part because that's what people wanted. It's like, why would I want to be in this guaranteed plan when I know I can earn 15% on my 401k money? So they became very popular. And around 2000, most plans were 100% funded. Many were over, few were under. But the bulk of the plans were pretty close to 100% funded. Well, what's happened is two things. Interest rates have just plummeted. So in 2000, you could probably a 30-year bond that would give you maybe 5 or 6% return. So if the actuary was counting on getting maybe an 8% total return, and you could get 6% of that from a bond, it's a pretty good chance you're going to get your 8%. Well, today, actuaries have reduced their anticipated rate of return to maybe 7, but the bonds are down at 2. So we have this huge gap between what we are hoping to earn to make our numbers work and what we can get are guaranteed to earn. So as a result, the plans are taking more risk. They're investing in private equity. They're investing in other alternative investments, and and they're doing pretty well. But the gap is so much bigger than it was 20 years ago in terms of the guaranteed amount you can get and what the actuaries want you to get. And the reason that's important is because if you think you're going to earn more, you can put in less. If you don't think you're going to earn as much, you need to put in more. So your costs are very dependent on what we predict your short-term costs are very dependent on what we predict you're going to earn in the markets. Now, of course, in the long run, it costs whatever it costs, but we try to budget it based on how much we think you're going to earn. And then, of course, the other problem for pensions is that people are living longer. Notwithstanding what we learned a few days ago about 2020 experience in the U.S., people are living longer, especially public servants, especially retired school teachers and other public workers. And so when they're living longer and you have a defined benefit plan, we've got to pay out for a longer period. So that's just putting a lot of strain on the cost numbers and the liabilities.
Thank you for those insights. So David had kind of gestured toward this earlier, but I'm interested in a couple of case studies. Do you all have examples you'd like to highlight of states with histories of sound funding practices, or maybe states that have faced challenges but have adopted innovative policies to help them plan for uncertainty and downturns? So let's go first to David and then to Flick.
Sure. And so our research, and if you look at some of our recent reports, we cover a number of them. We've identified a number of states that have really shown continued success at keeping their plans well funded, keeping their costs affordable and sustainable. So, contribution rates aren't spiking, and offering workers a secure retirement. So it's not that they solved the problem by having a meager benefit. It's really a robust retirement. And if you look across these different states, really what we see is that there's not a one size fits all policy. Each of them have different plan designs, different contribution policies, and different ways to manage risk. But I wanted to focus on Wisconsin as one of those successful states. And the Wisconsin retirement system covers almost every public employee in the state and offers participants a traditional final average salary defined benefit. As Anna mentioned, the most common approach in terms of a benefit formula. But the states use two innovations to help keep the plan well funded and cost stable. First, and kind of core to really all of the success stories we identify, is they have a strong contribution policy that's designed to get to full funding, allow, and also recover against any downturn and keep pension debt from spiraling out of control. And they stuck with that plan. And importantly, if you have a policy like that and you stick with it, it doesn't actually cost that much because your debt never compounds on itself and grows to really large levels. And then secondly, they have a risk sharing policy where retirees both share the gains when things are really good. So if investments are high, if the plan gets overfunded, the retirees get a bonus to their COLA, and also shares losses. So retirees could have their COLAs suspended going forward or taken away. But importantly, they're never going to end up with less than their core benefit. So they have this important guarantee, but also gains and losses are shared in a predictable formula that's been in place for decades at this point. But of course, Wisconsin, as we've described it, a well-funded system for many years. And it's easier to keep a system in good shape running than it is to fix a troubled one. And when we're trying to understand, how do you get a turnaround story? How do you take a Connecticut or an Illinois or a Pennsylvania and fix the problems that they're seeing? It's useful to look at examples from the past where they've done just that. So West Virginia's pension plans in the 90s were in terrible funding state. And in the mid 90s, policymakers decided that that was unacceptable and they committed to a funding policy and they stuck with it. Like anything in pensions, that takes time. In 2000, they're still the worst funded state by a sizable margin, below an Illinois or below a Connecticut. But based on the latest data, they're above average and they're trending towards full funding. And it's really the core of that has been fiscal discipline and a commitment to making good on the promise they made to their workers and retirees.
Yeah, thanks. David mentioned Wisconsin, and I just want to take a moment to give homage to their state. Their investment officer, David Villa, passed away a week or so ago, and he was very successful in their returns. He wasn't involved in the design so much, but that state Wisconsin Investment Board, SWIB, was kind of a pioneer in some very strong investment practices too. Anyway, sad news. In terms of another state experience that I'd like to talk about, I'll talk about my home state is Colorado. So we have a very interesting situation in Colorado. We were one of these funds that in 2000 was extremely well funded. And I actually at the time had done a report for the state auditor. We had what we called a gain sharing program where, we were so well funded that we were trying to figure out what to do with the extra money. So we gave it to healthcare benefits. We gave it to reduced contributions. And that was kind of innovative at the time. I kind of wish we'd given more to build up a bigger surplus because sure enough, by 2008, Colorado was not very well funded. And we were the first state, I wasn't working for the pension fund at the time. We're one of the first states to do major pension reform. And I think it was smart to do it so quickly because it was right at the depth of the recession and it was very politically palatable to members that their cost of living adjustments were reduced, for example. Now, it wasn't enough. So they went through another round of pension reform in 2018. And they have what's called an auto adjust, where every year, based on how well funded they are, contributions can be bumped up by the members, meaning employees, and by the state or the employers. And also the cost of living adjustments can be bumped down. Now, if things turn around and they get better, then those things unwind. But I think these flexible defined benefit plans are the way of the future. I think more and more states are going to be trying to put in little bits here and there of where they can adjust benefits somehow and not just have the employers be on the hook for all the increased costs.
Great. Well, thanks so much for the glimpse into the crystal ball. Speaking of innovation, let's talk a little bit more about risk assessment and what if scenarios. So this is a question for David. At least 12 states now have a mandatory requirement set forth in their laws to publish stress testing reports. The aim is to help educate policymakers like those in our audience. And David, I'm wondering if you can tell us about how stress testing is being deployed to help states think beyond best case scenarios when it comes to pension funding.
Sure. And so, obviously it's useful to know where your pension fund is today, but it's really more important where it's going. And both if everything goes as planned, which, we hope it will, but also if things are worse than expected, particularly in terms of investments, which is the biggest single risk we've seen affecting state pension plans. And so stress testing is a tool where you project forward, the important financial and actuarial data for the pension fund itself under current policy. And also what that means for state and local budgets. What's the employer contribution? What are the taxpayers on the hook for? And I said, both if everything goes as planned and under different low return scenarios. So what happens if we have another great recession? What happens if our investment returns are just 5%? And you can obviously build in other scenarios that are relevant to your state or your situation. And in terms of how this can be useful, Colorado is a great example. So they did their initial set of reforms after the Great Recession, but then part of that, they said, we want to review how things are going and we're going to conduct stress testing. And the state did a stress test of their retirement system that found a 1 in 4 chance under current policy that the plan would go insolvent and run out of money. And that result was understandably viewed as unacceptable by policymakers and plan administrators alike, and helped spur the discussion and analysis that went into the 2018 reform. And it really shows a lot of what stress testing can do for you as a policymaker, and can help you identify a problem before it emerges. So, if Colorado had waited till they're on the verge of insolvency or had run out of money, it's obviously much harder to get things back on track. Instead saying, oh, well, if this kind of thing happens, which is very possible, and we keep doing what we're doing, we'll be in trouble. Let's switch that in advance. And also lets you kind of test whether a given set of reforms is going to be enough or is going to be the right solution, or possibly even go too far. And so it lets you understand, okay, did we actually solve the problem? And then beyond thinking about this in terms of simply pension decisions, should I change my benefit? Should I change my funding policy? Should I change my assumptions? We see this as also a really important tool for policymakers in the budget process. So, if I'm one of these 12 states, before the COVID-19, hit in terms of both, drops in pension plan investments compared to what they're expecting and drops in revenue, I can have a sense of what that means for my budget, and I can help plan for it, whether it's simply knowing how much extra I'll need to find in the budget process, whether it's making sure my rainy day fund is efficient, or whatever other steps policymakers want to take to try to secure their budget against whatever happens to their pension fund.
Great, thank you. So we're winding down here. I'm going to try to wrap up about at the half hour or the hour-long mark, just because I know it's Friday afternoon and you all have been immersed in policy discussions all day if you've been joining us for the other parts of the series. But I will say, if you have questions for any of our experts, please don't hesitate to include your questions in the Q&A. And we will try to address them here. And if we don't have time, we can certainly get back to you offline. For now, I am interested in learning a bit more from each of our panelists about your organization's pension work in the states and how legislators and legislative staff might benefit from your organization's resources, or how they can draw on your organizations for expertise or help. At a very general level, what should our audience understand about how organizations like yours might be working in their state? So let's go first to Flick and then to David.
Thanks, Anna. Yeah, so as I mentioned, your state pension fund is like an independent body from the state, and they have their own actuary, and they do all kinds of projections and modeling. And like David said, they even do some stress tests, maybe not as robust as what a Pew would do or what I would do, but they do a lot of those things for the pension fund. Now, a handful of states also have another actuary, and like I'm the actuary, ongoing actuary for the state of Ohio. I was engaged by the state of Colorado recently for another project, and that's not unusual to have another actuary on behalf of the state trying to make some decisions. And Ohio is a great example where each of the pension funds themselves put together a plan to become funded within 30 years, but this oversight board that the state has, the Ohio Retirement Study Council, wanted someone to review that and make sure they bought off on it and did some testing on that. So that's the kind of work that I do, that other actuaries do, and it's somewhat similar, it sounds like, to David, what Pew can do. So let me turn it over to you.
Sure. And so, Pew broadly is a national nonprofit. We work in a number of policy areas, from environment to antibiotic resistance to criminal justice to our work with state and local pension funds. And, we started in this really just trying to identify a problem that we saw facing states. And then policymakers came to us and go, okay, we'll bite. We got a problem. What should we do? And wanted to try to answer that as well as we could. And as we said, we don't think there's a one size fits all solution. Different states have different policy goals, different financial situations, different views on risk. But there is a common set of analyses and data that is really useful in the decision making process. And then the other thing we do is, we're not going to know more about your state than you as a legislator, or you as a legislative staffer. But we're often going to know more about the other 49 states and what they've done, and either promising solutions that one state has tried or another, or in some cases, things that didn't pan out and things that you might not want to look at because it hasn't been successful. So sharing that and helping, not come up with their own solution, but helping policymakers figure out what works for their state is really how we enjoy helping.
Terrific. Okay. Well, one last question, and then I think we'll shut it down. What is the one thing that you both wish lawmakers better understood about getting pension funding decisions right? Let's go first to Flick and then to David. And Flick, I think you're muted.
Thank you. And since you all read my lips, I won't repeat what I just said. As an actuary, I'll take that perspective. I think David said there's no one size fits all. And I think it's really important for you to realize that, what one state has issues they've had, another state may not have. For example, I live in Colorado. We're a growing state. That helps a lot. If we weren't growing, if we were shrinking, our pension problems would be much more severe. But the one thing I want you all to try to understand about your system is it's got one of two ways to do its costs, no matter what the actuary is making calculations of what should be put in. And in some states, whatever the actuary says should be put in, that is put in, that must be put in. The statute requires that if the contributions have gone from 20% of pay to 21% of pay, somehow you better find 21% of pay. And about half the states are like that. And then about another half of the states are not like that, where they've got a statute that says we will put in X% of pay. And in those states, the actuary comes and says, guess what, that's not quite enough. Or yes, that'll get you fully funded a certain period of time. So you are one or the other. You either have to put in what the actuary says, or you put in what the law says, which is already a number that's written down. And so I think if you had an understanding of which of those two models applies to you, then you might see that approaches in other states may not work because they have the opposite model.
And then I think one thing that's really useful for all of you to understand is that changing the benefit for new hires doesn't change what's happened in the past. And it may be a very important and useful change, whether it's finding a way to make benefits more affordable or finding ways to manage risk or finding a benefit that works better for your workforce. But if you have an unfunded liability, the solution to that is broadly going to be, finding a payment plan that works, both in terms of closing that funding gap and making sure the benefits are there for workers and works for your budgets, right? Is not asking more than the budget can provide. And so it's really, you got to fix both pieces of it to really know that you have a comprehensive solution.
Outstanding. Well, David Drain and Flick Fornia, thank you so much for joining us today. I think we've benefited a lot from your expertise. And I want to thank our audience for joining us. Feel free to contact NCSL if you have follow-up questions about any of this. My contact information is on the bios and resources section below the video player. And thank you all once again.
Thank you.